The autumn wind carried the scent of fallen leaves across Lexington Common as red, white, and blue bunting fluttered against the colonial buildings. Veterans Day in Massachusetts always brought a certain solemnity to the historic town where America's fight for freedom began. Among the gathered crowd, mostly gray-haired men with military caps adorned with unit pins and campaign ribbons, sat retired Colonel James Iron Jack Harrington. At 95, Harrington's once powerful frame had yielded to time, but his posture remained unmistakably military. His weathered hands rested atop a polished maple cane, fingers adorned with his West Point ring and the gold band he had worn for 68 years until Elizabeth's passing 3 winters ago. A carefully pressed blue blazer hung from his shoulders, now too broad for his diminished form, weighted with medals that told stories of valor from another era. The mayor of Lexington, a woman young enough to be his granddaughter, approached the podium. Today we are especially honored to have with us the last surviving tank commander of the legendary Thunderbolt crew, the man whose exploits were chronicled in the recent best-selling memoir, Steel Courage. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel James Harrington. Applause rippled through the crowd. James nodded in acknowledgement, his pale blue eyes still sharp beneath bushy white eyebrows. As he began to rise, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over him. The faces before him blurred. The familiar sensation of cold sweat beaded on his forehead. "Colonel, are you all right?" A young Army captain in dress uniform materialized at his side, concern etched across his features. James waved him off. "Just need a moment, son." But his body betrayed him. The dizziness intensified, and the next thing he knew, hands were supporting him, easing him back into his chair. "Get the medic," someone called out. "No hospitals," James managed to say. His greatest fear wasn't death. He'd made peace with that prospect decades ago. It was dying in some sterile room, away from the sky and earth. "Just take me back to the hotel." 20 minutes later, the captain helped James into the back seat of a black SUV. "I'm sorry about this, sir. The hotel's just 10 minutes away. We can reschedule the book signing for tomorrow if you're feeling up to it." James nodded, embarrassment and frustration churning within him. He'd survived Normandy, Market Garden, and the Battle of the Bulge, yet here he was, defeated by his own failing body at a small-town ceremony. The SUV turned onto Main Street, then slowed unexpectedly. Through the window, James saw curious onlookers gathering, pointing at something ahead. The captain's phone buzzed. He checked it, then turned to James with an odd expression. "Sir, there's been a change of plans for your transportation to the book signing. If you're feeling better, that is." The SUV pulled to the curb. The captain exited first, then opened James's door. The old soldier emerged slowly, one hand gripping his cane, the other accepting the captain's steadying arm. What he saw, parked in front of the colonial-style Lexington Inn, stole the breath from his lungs. Gleaming in the autumn sunlight sat an M4A3 E8 Sherman tank, the Easy 8 variant, its olive drab paint immaculate, white star emblazoned on its side, the name Thunderbolt stenciled in precise white letters across the long-barreled 76mm gun's mantlet. Standing atop the tank was a man in period-correct tanker's uniform, goggles pushed up on his helmet. "We thought you might prefer this ride to the museum, Colonel," the captain said with a grin. The years fell away from James Harrington in an instant. The weakness that had plagued him minutes before vanished. His spine straightened as if by instinct. "Good God," he whispered, his voice suddenly steady. "Thunderbolt, after all these years." He moved toward the tank without assistance, his cane forgotten in the captain's hand. When he reached the massive vehicle, he placed his palm against the cold steel of its hull, feeling the connection to another time, another version of himself. Tears welled in his eyes, but he did not try to hide them. "Who did this?" he asked. "Your grandson coordinated with the Veterans Heritage Museum. They restored her based on photographs and your descriptions in the book." James nodded, unable to speak. He ran his fingers along the tank's side, remembering every inch of the machine that had carried him through humanity's darkest hours. The tank that had been his home, his fortress, his weapon. "Would you like to go up, sir?" the man in the tanker's uniform asked, extending his hand. For a moment, James hesitated. Then with a determined nod, he grasped the offered hand and found himself being carefully helped up the side of the Sherman. His old muscles protested, but adrenaline carried him forward. When he settled into the commander's position, the familiar confines of the turret around him, something awakened in his soul that had long been dormant. "Still fits," he said, a smile breaking across his face. And suddenly the old colonel was laughing, a sound so unexpected that onlookers exchanged glances of surprise and delight. In that moment, James Harrington was no longer an old man counting his remaining days. He was once again the young tank commander who had led his men across a continent at war. Quincy, Massachusetts, September 1942. The shipyard whistles blared across Boston Harbor as another destroyer slid into the water. James Harrington stood ramrod straight in his crisp uniform, watching the launching ceremony from a distance. His father, Brigadier General William Harrington, stood among the dignitaries on the viewing platform, his chest heavy with medals from the Great War. At 25, James was the very image of a West Point graduate, tall, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and clear eyes that missed nothing. 3 generations of Harrington men had passed through West Point before him, each serving with distinction in the infantry. His great-grandfather had fought at Gettysburg, his grandfather in the Spanish-American War, and his father in the blood and mud of the Argonne Forest. James had maintained the family tradition of excellence at the academy, graduating 3rd in his class. But he had broken with tradition in one crucial respect. He had chosen the Armored Corps instead of the infantry. That decision had created a rift between father and son that showed no signs of healing. As the ceremony concluded, James made his way toward the officers' area. His father spotted him approaching and gave a curt nod. "Your train leaves tonight?" the general asked. "Yes, sir. Fort Hood. I report to the 2nd Armored Division tomorrow." The elder Harrington's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Colonel Patterson is a good man. Infantry officer in the last war. He understands proper soldiering." James felt the familiar tension rising. "The nature of warfare is changing, father. Armor is the future." "The nature of courage never changes, son. A man looks his enemy in the eye. Tanks," he shook his head, "tanks are steel coffins, or worse, they're the weapons of men who can't bear to see the consequences of their actions." James had heard this argument too many times before. The Germans didn't seem to think so when they rolled through France. And look what good their vaunted blitzkrieg did them in Russia. The general straightened his jacket. "Your mother wanted me to remind you about dinner tonight. Your brothers will be there. Thomas is shipping out with the Marines next week." "I'll be there, sir." As his father walked away, James felt the weight of disapproval on his shoulders. His decision to join the Armored Corps had been made with clear-eyed purpose. The future of warfare wouldn't be determined by men charging across open fields. It would be one with combined arms, with tanks and aircraft working alongside infantry. He had studied the German campaigns extensively, seen what their panzer divisions had accomplished. That night, the family dinner proceeded with superficial pleasantness. James's mother, Catherine, had prepared his favorite meal, pot roast with potatoes and carrots. His brothers, Thomas and Robert, both infantry officers, dominated the conversation with talk of their assignments. James remained quiet, answering questions directed to him, but otherwise keeping his thoughts to himself. As dessert was served, his father cleared his throat. "I received word today. James has been given command of his own tank company. Quite an achievement for an officer his age." Catherine Harrington beamed. "Oh, James, that's wonderful news." "Thank you, Mother." His father raised his glass. "To Captain James Harrington, may he bring honor to the family name." They drank the toast, but James could hear the unspoken qualification in his father's voice. Honor, despite his choice of service. Later, as he prepares to leave for the train station, his mother handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Your grandfather's compass," she said. "He carried it through 2 wars. I thought you might like to have it." James unwrapped the brass compass, feeling its weight in his palm. The needle swung true to north. "He would be proud of you, James," she said, reaching up to straighten his tie. "Your father is proud too in his way. He just worries." James kissed her cheek. "I know, Mother. I'll write when I can." The train journey to Texas gave James time to study the personnel files of the men who would form his tank crew. As a captain, he would command the entire company, but he would also serve as the commander of the lead tank. The Army was expanding rapidly, and experienced tank crews were in short supply. Most of these men had never seen the inside of a tank before basic training. His driver would be Technical Sergeant Michael O'Connor, a former mechanic from Detroit who could reportedly take an engine apart and reassemble it blindfolded. His gunner, Corporal Robert Thompson, was a Kentucky farm boy who had won state shooting competitions before the war. Private First Class Luis Mendez, the loader, hailed from New Mexico and had worked in the mines before enlisting. And finally, Private Benjamin Goldman, a radio operator from New York City, a college student whose studies in electrical engineering had been interrupted by the war. Different backgrounds, different skills, different parts of America. It would be James's job to forge them into a cohesive unit capable of surviving the crucible of combat. Fort Hood sprawled across the Texas landscape, a city of uniform buildings and training fields. James reported to headquarters where he was greeted by Colonel Patterson, a weathered officer with a permanent squint. "Harrington," Patterson said, examining him. "General Harrington's boy?" "Yes, sir." "Infantry family. What brought you to the tanks?" "I believe it's where I can best serve, sir." Patterson nodded. "Well, we need good officers. You'll find your men at Barracks 33. Your equipment arrived yesterday, M4A3 Shermans, fresh from the factory." "Thank you, sir. When can I expect to begin training exercises?" "Tomorrow morning, 0600. We don't waste time here, Captain. The situation in North Africa is deteriorating, and the Pentagon wants us ready to deploy within 3 months." James saluted and made his way to the barracks. The Texas heat was oppressive, so different from the Massachusetts coastal breezes he had grown up with. When he reached Barracks 33, he found organized chaos as men settled in, stowed gear, and established the hierarchies that would define their lives for the duration. "10 hot!" someone called as he entered, and the room snapped to attention. "At ease," James said, scanning the faces before him. "I'm Captain Harrington. I'll be your company commander. I'd like to meet with my tank commanders immediately, and then with my own crew." The men he would personally lead stepped forward as the others dispersed. Sergeant O'Connor was a barrel-chested man with forearms like tree trunks. Corporal Thompson was tall and lanky, with the patient eyes of a marksman. Private Mendez was compact and muscular, with quick movements that suggested athletic ability. Private Goldman was slighter than the others, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Gentlemen," James said, "we have 3 months to become the best tank crew in the United States Army. Our lives will depend on how well we work together." O'Connor spoke up. "Begging your pardon, sir, but have you had previous experience commanding tanks?" "I trained on tanks at Fort Knox after West Point, Sergeant, but this will be my first command." The men exchanged glances that James couldn't miss. He was an untested officer in their eyes, perhaps one who had received his command through family connections. "I understand your concerns," James continued, "but I give you my word that I will never ask any of you to take a risk I wouldn't take myself. Now let's go see our tank." The M4A3 Sherman waited for them in the motor pool, its factory paint still glossy, its treads barely marked with dust. 33 tons of American engineering, armed with a 75mm main gun and two .30 caliber machine guns. It was not the most heavily armored or powerfully gunned tank in the war. The German Tigers and Panthers held those distinctions. But it was reliable, adaptable, and could be produced in numbers the Germans couldn't match. "She's a beauty," O'Connor said, running his hand along the hall. "What do we call her, sir?" Goldman asked. "The other crews are already naming theirs." James looked at the tank thoughtfully. "Thunderbolt," he said, "after my grandfather. His men called him that during the Civil War because he struck so quickly." "Thunderbolt," Thompson repeated, "has a nice ring to it." For the next 2 days, they familiarized themselves with their vehicle. O'Connor disappeared into the engine compartment for hours, emerging covered in grease but with a satisfied expression. Thompson spent his time adjusting the gun sights to his liking. Mendez practiced loading shells until his movements became fluid and automatic. Goldman tested the radio equipment, establishing communication protocols with the other tanks in the company. James observed it all, learning the strengths and limitations of both his men and their machine. He had studied tank warfare extensively in theory, but the practical reality of commanding this steel beast was something else entirely. On the 3rd day, they took Thunderbolt onto the training grounds for their first live-fire exercise. The desert landscape of central Texas provided an ideal environment for practicing maneuvers, with its open spaces and varied terrain. "Target 2 o'clock, range 800 yards, James called from the commander's position. "Identified," Thompson responded from the gunner's seat below. "He loaded," Mendez reported, having slammed a high-explosive shell into the breech. "Fire when ready." The Sherman's gun roared, the recoil rocking the vehicle. Downrange, a plume of dust erupted near the target. "Adjustment needed, up 50, right 25, James instructed. Thompson made the corrections. The second shot struck the target dead center, sending splinters of wood flying as the shell demolished the mock enemy position. "Good hit," James said. "Reload and prepare to advance." They moved through the training course, engaging targets as they appeared. O'Connor maneuvered the 33-ton vehicle with surprising delicacy, finding the best positions for Thompson to take his shots. By the end of the day, they had achieved a respectable score, though not as high as James had hoped. As the weeks passed, they improved steadily. The men began to function less as individuals and more as parts of a single organism. James insisted on cross-training, each man learning the other's jobs well enough to fill in if necessary. It wasn't standard procedure, but James believed it could save their lives someday. Relations with the other tank crews were sometimes tense. The Sherman crews were a mix of farm boys, factory workers, and young men from every corner of America. Regional and ethnic tensions occasionally flared. Goldman, being Jewish, faced anti-Semitic comments from some of the other soldiers. Mendez's Hispanic heritage made him a target for others. James dealt with these incidents swiftly and severely. "We're fighting the Nazis," he told his company after one particularly ugly incident. "If any of you share their ideas about racial superiority, you're in the wrong army." The final training exercise was scheduled for late November. Colonel Patterson had designed a complex scenario involving a simulated German breakthrough that the tank company would have to contain and then counterattack. Adding to the pressure, several high-ranking officers would be observing, including a brigadier general from Washington. The morning of the exercise, James gathered his crew for a final briefing. "This is our chance to prove ourselves," he told them. "We've worked harder than any other crew. Now we show the results." They mounted up and moved to their starting position. James couldn't help noticing that the scenario seemed particularly challenging, with more enemy forces than had been used in previous exercises. As he scanned the observation stand with his binoculars, he understood why. Among the officers watching was his father, Brigadier General William Harrington. The exercise began with the firing of a flare. The Sherman tanks advanced across the training ground, encountering simulated enemy fire from anti-tank guns. Two tanks from another platoon were quickly knocked out by referees who judged that they would have been hit in a real battle. James directed his company to take cover behind a ridge, then sent scouts forward on foot to assess the enemy positions. Based on their reports, he devised a flanking maneuver that would allow his tanks to approach from an unexpected direction. "O'Connor, take us around that hill to the east," he ordered. "Radio silence from here on. Goldman, use the recognition signals we practiced to direct the other tanks." They executed the flanking movement perfectly, emerging behind the German positions and eliminating them before they could reorient their defenses. The exercise was proceeding exactly according to plan when a runner appeared with an urgent message from Colonel Patterson. "Real-world emergency, sir," the private reported. "Tank 7 has thrown a track on the North Range and is reporting an engine fire. Rescue vehicles are being dispatched, but Colonel Patterson wants to know if you can provide immediate assistance since you're closest to their position." James quickly assessed the situation. The exercise was nearly complete, and his company had performed exceptionally well. His father was watching, expecting him to finish the mission as planned. "Sergeant O'Connor, change of plans. We're heading to the North Range to assist Tank 7. "Sir?" O'Connor questioned. "That'll forfeit our position in the exercise." "There's a real fire, Sergeant. The exercise just became secondary." James directed his company to continue with the planned operation while he took Thunderbolt to assist the disabled tank. As they crested the hill overlooking the North Range, they saw the stricken Sherman with smoke pouring from its engine compartment. The crew had evacuated and were attempting to fight the fire with extinguishers, but the flames were growing. "Get us down there fast," James ordered. O'Connor guided the tank down the slope at a dangerous speed. When they reached the burning vehicle, James ordered his crew to stay inside while he jumped down with their larger fire extinguisher. The heat was intense, but he worked with the other tank's crew to bring the flames under control before they could reach the ammunition storage. When the rescue vehicles finally arrived, the fire was out. The tank was damaged but salvageable, and more importantly, no one was injured. As James climbed back into Thunderbolt, he saw Colonel Patterson's Jeep approaching, with his father riding in the passenger seat. The colonel was first to speak when they reached the scene. "Quick thinking, Captain Harrington. You prevented what could have been a serious incident." "Thank you, sir. My men deserve the credit for their quick response." General Harrington surveyed the scene, his expression unreadable. "You abandoned your objective to assist another unit," he observed. "The mission was nearly complete, sir, and a real emergency takes precedence over a training scenario. Even if it costs you the victory you were about to achieve?" James met his father's gaze steadily. "Some things are more important than winning, sir." Something flickered in the general's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a reassessment? He gave a short nod. Carry on, Captain. As he turned to leave, he added, your grandfather would have made the same choice. Coming from his father, it was high praise indeed. That evening, as James sat alone in the officers' club, Colonel Patterson joined him. Your company performed exceptionally today, despite the interruption. The observers were impressed. Thank you, sir. Patterson took a sip of his bourbon. Your father had a hand in designing today's scenario, you know. Made it especially challenging. I think he wanted to see what you were made of. James wasn't surprised. And what was his assessment? He didn't say exactly, but he did mention that the 2nd Armored might have gained a good officer, even if the infantry lost one. Patterson smiled. Coming from him, that's practically a ringing endorsement. The next morning, James received his deployment orders. The 2nd Armored Division would ship out to England in January 1944 to prepare for the coming invasion of Europe. They would have Christmas at home before departing. James granted leave to his men, encouraging them to spend time with their families. He himself returned to Quincy for the holidays, where the reunion with his family was warmer than he had expected. His father, while still reserved, treated him with a new respect. They even spent an evening discussing tank tactics, with the general offering insights from his infantry perspective that James found surprisingly valuable. On his last night at home, James sat in his father's study, sharing a rare glass of scotch with the old soldier. You'll be in England for several months before the invasion, his father said. Use that time wisely. Train your men for the reality of combat, not the textbook version. I will, sir. And James? The general hesitated, searching for words. Tank warfare is not what I would have chosen for you. But it's clear that you found your place in it. Your men respect you. That's the most important quality in an officer. James nodded, accepting the closest thing to approval his father might ever give him. I've arranged for you to receive the new Sherman variant when it becomes available, the general continued. The one with the 76mm gun. It'll give you a better chance against those German Tigers. James was genuinely surprised. Thank you, sir. That could make a real difference. The general raised his glass. To your safe return. They drank in silence, both men aware of the odds that James faced. The casualty rates for tank crews on the front lines were sobering, but neither spoke of it. That was not the Harrington way. The voyage to England aboard the Queen Mary was mercifully uneventful, though the great ocean liner, now serving as a troopship, was packed to capacity with soldiers. James used the time to continue training his men, conducting classes on German armor, tactics, and the terrain they would likely encounter in France. They arrived in Liverpool in February 1944 and were transported to Salisbury Plain, where the Allied forces were gathering for the coming invasion. The English countryside was transformed into a vast military camp, with tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces stretching as far as the eye could see. True to his father's arrangement, James's company received the first shipment of the M4A3E8 EZ-8 Shermans, with their more powerful 76mm guns and improved suspension. Thunderbolt was among the first to be upgraded, and O'Connor spent days familiarizing himself with the new engine and drive system. She's a lady now, sir, he told James after the first test drive. Smoother ride, more power, and that new gun will give the Krauts something to think about. Training intensified as spring arrived. The invasion everyone knew would come soon. The exact date and location remained closely guarded secrets, but the massive buildup could have only one purpose. James drove his men hard, but no harder than he drove himself. They practiced every aspect of tank warfare: breakthrough tactics, infantry support, anti-tank engagements, urban combat. By May, they were as ready as they could be. In late May, they were moved to a sealed camp near the coast. Security was absolute. No one entered or left without authorization. It was there that they finally received their briefing on Operation Overlord. They would be part of the second wave landing at Omaha Beach, tasked with breaking out from the beachhead and pushing inland. The night before they were to embark, James gathered his crew for a final word. Tomorrow we face the real thing, he told them. Everything we've trained for, everything we've prepared for comes down to this. I won't lie to you, it will be difficult and dangerous. But I believe in each of you, and I believe in us as a crew. We've become something special these past months, something that can make a difference in this war. O'Connor cleared his throat. Sir, the boys and I have something for you. He handed James a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside was a metal plate with the name Thunderbolt engraved on it, along with a lightning bolt striking through a V for victory. "We thought we should make it official," Goldman explained. "The insignia is painted on the turret already." James was touched by the gesture. "Thank you, all of you. We'll mount this on her tomorrow." After the others had gone to write their letters home and try to sleep, James noticed that Thompson was still outside the tent, staring at the stars. "Everything all right, Corporal?" he asked. Thompson startled slightly. "Yes, sir, just thinking." James could see that something was troubling the gunner. "What's on your mind? If there's anything I can do." Thompson hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter. "Got this yesterday, sir. My wife just had our first child, a boy." He smiled briefly, then his expression clouded. "But the letter says he's sickly. The doctors aren't sure." He trailed off. "I'm sorry to hear that, Thompson. It's hard to be so far from home at a time like this." Thompson nodded. "Sir, I have to ask. I know it's impossible, but if there was any way I could get back, just for a little while." James placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "I can't send you home, Thompson. You know that, but..." An idea occurred to him. "Wait here." He returned to his quarters and placed a call to the medical unit. Major Stern, the chief medical officer, was an acquaintance from West Point days. "David, I need a favor," James explained the situation. "Is there anything you can do?" There was a pause on the line. "I can't promise anything, Jack, but I have a colleague at Walter Reed who might be able to arrange a transfer for the child if his condition is serious. I'd need more details. I'll get them to you tonight." James returned to Thompson and explained the possibility. "Write down everything you know about your son's condition, the hospital he's in, everything. I'll try to get him transferred to a military hospital with better care." Thompson's eyes widened. "You would do that, sir?" "I can't promise results, Thompson, but I can promise to try." Later that night, as James prepared his own letters home, there was a knock at his door. Thompson stood there, letter in hand. "I wanted to thank you, sir," he said, "even if nothing comes of it. Let's hope something does." Thompson hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "Sir, I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow or the days after, you can count on me. I won't let you down." "I never thought you would, Corporal." After Thompson left, James finished his letters, one to his parents and brothers, another to Sarah Mitchell, the woman he hoped to marry when the war was over. He wrote of ordinary things, avoiding any hint of the invasion to come. But he couldn't help adding a line to Sarah that revealed more than censors might approve. "By the time you read this, the world will have changed. Whatever happens, know that my thoughts are with you." He sealed the envelopes and placed them with the mail to be delivered after the invasion began. Then he tried to sleep, knowing that the next day would bring challenges beyond anything they had trained for. The face of each of his men passed before his mind's eye. O'Connor with his mechanical genius, Thompson with his marksmanship, Mendez with his quiet strength, Goldman with his quick mind. They were his crew, his responsibility, his family now. And tomorrow they would face the crucible together. James Harrington drifted into an uneasy sleep, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. Outside, the vast invasion fleet gathered in the darkness, preparing to deliver the greatest amphibious assault in military history. The liberation of Europe was about to begin, and Thunderbolt would be part of it. In his dreams, James saw his grandfather's compass, its needle pointing true north, guiding him forward into the uncertainty that lay ahead. Dawn broke over the English Channel on June 6, 1944, revealing a sight unprecedented in human history. The sea itself seemed to have transformed into metal as thousands of Allied ships stretched to the horizon. The great invasion, the liberation of Europe, had begun. Captain James Harrington stood on the deck of the LST, watching as the first waves of infantry hit Omaha Beach. Even from this distance, he could see that the landing was meeting fierce resistance. Explosions dotted the shoreline. The water near the beach had turned red. "It's rough going, sir," Sergeant O'Connor observed beside him, his usual mechanical bravado subdued by the spectacle before them. James nodded grimly. "The German defenses are stronger than intelligence suggested." He raised his binoculars, focusing on the cliffs overlooking the beach, where German artillery continued to pound the incoming forces. "Those guns need to be silenced if we're going to get our tanks ashore." Their LST was part of the second wave, carrying the Sherman tanks that would provide crucial support to the infantry. But first, the beachhead had to be secured. The minutes stretched into hours as they watched the desperate battle unfold. Finally, radio reports indicated that Army Rangers had taken the cliffs at Point du Hoc and neutralized the big guns. The murderous fire slackened, and their LST began its approach to the beach. "Mount up," James ordered his crew. "We're going in." They climbed into Thunderbolt, sealing the hatches. The Sherman's engine rumbled to life under O'Connor's skilled hands. James took his position in the commander's cupola, standing with his head and shoulders exposed for better visibility. It was the most vulnerable position in the tank, but a commander needed to see. The bow doors of the LST opened, revealing the chaos of Omaha Beach. Wrecked landing craft littered the shoreline. Bodies floated in the bloody surf or lay sprawled on the sand. And still, German machine gun fire swept the beach from concrete bunkers that had survived the bombardment. "Driver, forward," James commanded. O'Connor guided Thunderbolt down the ramp and into the water. The Sherman had been waterproofed for the landing, its engine intake and exhaust extended upward with trunks that would allow it to drive through up to 6 feet of water. The tank lurched forward, then found its footing on the seabed. "Keep moving," James urged as shells began to splash around them. "Don't stop until we reach the seawall." The journey from the water's edge to the relative safety of the seawall seemed endless. Twice, mortar rounds landed close enough to rock the tank violently. Machine gun bullets pinged harmlessly off the Sherman's armor. Through it all, O'Connor kept Thunderbolt moving steadily forward, crushing debris beneath its tracks. When they finally reached the seawall, James surveyed the situation. A company of infantry was pinned down by fire from a bunker about 400 yards up the slope. "Goldman, radio the infantry commander," James ordered. "Tell him we'll take out that bunker if his men can provide covering fire for our advance." The plan was quickly arranged. On James's signal, the infantry laid down a barrage of fire. Thunderbolt broke cover, charging up the slope toward the bunker. German anti-tank rounds began to streak toward them. "Thompson, target that firing port," James commanded. "He round." "Target acquired," Thompson confirmed, his voice steady despite the danger. "Fire when ready." The Sherman's 76mm gun roared. The high-explosive shell struck just above the bunker's firing port, sending concrete fragments flying. Thompson immediately fired a second round into the same spot, widening the breach. "Cease fire," James ordered as they neared the bunker. "Mendez, give me the 50. The tank's 50 caliber machine gun, mounted on the turret, swung into position. James raked the interior of the damaged bunker with heavy fire, silencing the defenders inside. With the bunker neutralized, the infantry surged forward. By nightfall, they had secured a tenuous foothold on Omaha Beach. The cost had been terrible, thousands of men dead or wounded, but the invasion had succeeded. The road to Berlin now lay open, though it would be long and bloody. In the days that followed, Thunderbolt led the breakout from the beachhead, pushing inland through the dense hedgerows of Normandy. The terrain favored the defenders, allowing German anti-tank teams to approach dangerously close before revealing their positions. On June 13th, they encountered their first German Tiger tank near the town of Harrington. The massive vehicle, with its 88mm gun and thick armor, was more than a match for the Sherman. "Target 2 o'clock, range 1,000 yards, James called, spotting the Tiger partially concealed behind a stone farmhouse. "I see it," Thompson replied, rotating the turret. "Sir, that's beyond effective range for a killing shot." James knew he was right. The Sherman's 76mm gun could penetrate the Tiger's armor, but only at closer ranges or by hitting vulnerable points. "Hold fire, O'Connor. Take us around that hedgerow. We'll approach from the flank." The maneuver was dangerous but necessary. As they crept along the hedgerow, James ordered the rest of his company to provide distraction by firing smoke rounds near the Tiger. The German tank commander took the bait, turning his attention toward the perceived threat. "Range now 600 yards, James updated as they emerged from the hedgerow. Thompson aimed for the side armor just below the turret ring. "Armor-piercing loaded," Mendez reported. "On target," Thompson confirmed. "Fire." The Sherman rocked with the recoil. Through his binoculars, James saw the round strike precisely where aimed. The Tiger shuddered but did not stop. Its turret began to swing toward them. "It's still operational," James warned. "Hit it again, same spot." Thompson fired again, his calm under pressure paying off. The second round penetrated the damaged area. A moment later, flames erupted from the Tiger's hatches as the ammunition inside ignited. The German crew tried to escape the burning tank. Two made it out before the vehicle exploded in a fireball that sent its massive turret cartwheeling through the air. "Target destroyed," Thompson reported unnecessarily, a slight tremor in his voice the only indication of the tension he had been under. "Good shooting," James acknowledged. "Let's regroup with the company." That evening, as they performed maintenance on Thunderbolt, James received a message to report to the battalion command post. There he found Colonel Matthews, their battalion commander, speaking with a civilian who wore the uniform of a war correspondent. Captain Harrington, Matthews greeted him. This is Walter Sullivan from the Associated Press. He's doing a story on our tank units, and I told him about your engagement with the Tiger today. Sullivan stepped forward, hand extended. He was a lean man in his 40s with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Quite an achievement, Captain. The Tigers have been giving our armor fits all through this campaign. James shook the correspondent's hand. My gunner deserves the credit, sir. Corporal Thompson is the best shot in the battalion. I'd like to interview you and your crew, if that's possible, Sullivan said. Get some photographs, too. The folks back home need to hear these success stories. Of course, James agreed, though we're scheduled for an operation tomorrow. I'll tag along if that's acceptable to your colonel. Matthews nodded. Sullivan has clearance. Just keep him alive, Captain. I don't need the paperwork if he gets himself killed. The next morning, Sullivan joined them as Thunderbolt led a reconnaissance mission toward the town of St. Lo. The correspondent settled in the turret beside James, camera ready. So tell me about your crew, Captain, Sullivan prompted as they moved through the countryside. James described each man briefly. O'Connor's mechanical genius, Thompson's marksmanship, Mendez's strength and reliability, Goldman's intelligence and communication skills. And what about you? Sullivan asked. Word is you're from a military family. West Point, like my father and grandfather before me, James confirmed, keeping his focus on scanning the surroundings for threats. But you chose tanks instead of infantry. That's a break from tradition, isn't it? Before James could answer, Goldman's voice came through the intercom. Captain, radio message from Baker Company. They've spotted German armor moving towards St. Lo from the south. Understood. Tell them we're changing course to intercept. James turned to Sullivan. You may get more of a story than you bargained for, Mr. Sullivan. The correspondent's eyes gleamed with anticipation. That's what I'm here for, Captain. They rendezvoused with Baker Company at a crossroads 2 miles from St. Lo. The German force consisted of several Panzer IVs, lighter than the Tiger but still deadly opponents. James deployed his tanks in an ambush position along a ridge overlooking the road the Germans were expected to use. Remember your training, he reminded his crew. Wait for my order to fire. We want the first volley to count. They didn't have to wait long. 4 Panzer IVs appeared on the road below, moving confidently, unaware of the American tanks waiting in concealment. Hold, James cautioned as Thompson aligned his sights on the lead tank. Let them get closer. When the German tanks were within 400 yards, James gave the command. All tanks, fire! 5 Sherman tanks fired almost simultaneously. 3 of the Panzer IVs erupted in flames immediately. The 4th managed to return fire, its shell striking perilously close to Thunderbolt's position. Target the survivor, James ordered. Thompson adjusted his aim and fired. The round struck the Panzer's turret, disabling its gun but not destroying the vehicle. The German tank began to reverse, seeking escape. Finish it, James commanded. The second shot penetrated the Panzer's engine compartment. Black smoke poured from the rear of the tank as its crew abandoned the crippled vehicle. As the echo of gunfire faded, Sullivan snapped photographs of the burning German tanks. That was remarkable, Captain. 4 enemy tanks destroyed without a single loss on our side. James knew they had been fortunate. The Germans had been caught by surprise, negating their technical advantages. Such one-sided victories were rare in tank warfare. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, he said, though I prefer to be both when possible. Sullivan laughed. That's the quote I'll use for my article. The photograph Sullivan took that day appeared in newspapers across America 2 weeks later. Thunderbolt, with James standing in the commander's cupola, became a symbol of American armor advancing through France. Letters began to arrive from people back home who had seen the articles, including one from James's father that contained a rare note of pride. July faded into August, and the Allied forces broke out of Normandy, sending the German armies into retreat across France. There were hard fights along the way, but the momentum now favored the Allies. Paris was liberated on August 25th, and the advance continued toward the German border. Through it all, Thunderbolt remained at the forefront, and its crew survived when many others did not. The bond between them grew stronger with each engagement. They developed routines and superstitions. O'Connor insisted on checking each track link personally before any major operation. Thompson would not fire the main gun until he had whispered, "This one's for Johnny," his son's name. Mendez kept a small medallion of St. Barbara, patron of artillerymen, taped inside his station, and Goldman had scratched a Star of David into the radio panel. James allowed these personal touches, understanding that they provided comfort amid the chaos of war. He had his own ritual, Each morning he would consult his grandfather's compass, not for navigation, but as a reminder of the legacy he carried. In mid-September, they received orders to support Operation Market Garden, the ambitious Allied plan to secure bridges over the Rhine and Holland and open a path into Germany. Thunderbolt was assigned to the ground forces tasked with relieving the airborne troops who would seize those bridges. The operation began on September 17th, with thousands of paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines. Thunderbolt and the rest of the armored column began their advance up the single narrow road that led to the bridges, a road that quickly became known as Hell's Highway due to the intense German resistance. On the second day of the operation, they encountered a German ambush near the town of Eindhoven. Anti-tank guns concealed in the buildings opened fire on the American column. The lead Sherman was hit and burst into flames, blocking the narrow street. "Back up," James ordered. "We need to find another route." O'Connor began to reverse Thunderbolt, but they had only moved a few yards when a shell struck nearby, showering the tank with debris. Through the smoke, James saw German infantry advancing with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. "Thompson, machine gun on those infantry," he commanded. "O'Connor, get us out of this kill box." The Sherman's coaxial machine gun opened up, forcing the German infantry to take cover. O'Connor maneuvered the tank down a narrow alley, barely wide enough to accommodate its width. They emerged onto a parallel street, only to face another anti-tank gun at the far end. "Target, 12 o'clock, James called out. Thompson traversed the turret. "I see it. Fire when ready." The 76mm gun roared, destroying the anti-tank position. James directed them forward, looking for a way to flank the German ambush and relieve the trapped American column. As they approached an intersection, a tremendous explosion rocked the tank. A hidden German gun had scored a hit on their left side. Warning lights flashed inside the crew compartment. "Status report," James demanded. "Left track damaged," O'Connor reported. "We're still mobile, but steering is compromised." "Goldman, radio status and location to company command," James ordered. Then he heard a groan from below. "Who's hit?" "It's Goldman," Mendez called back. "Shrapnel came through the radio panel." James dropped down from the cupola to assess the situation. Goldman lay slumped over his radio, blood soaking his uniform where metal fragments had pierced his shoulder and chest. "How bad?" James asked, reaching for the first aid kit. Mendez had already begun treating the wounds. "Bad, sir. He needs a medic soon." James made a quick decision. "O'Connor, get us to the nearest aid station. Thompson, keep that gun ready in case we meet resistance." They limped through the town, avoiding the main battle areas, and reached a field hospital set up in what had been a school before the war. Goldman was quickly transferred to the care of the medical staff, who rushed him into surgery. Hours later, as James waited for news, a doctor approached. "Your radio man will live, Captain, but his war is over. The damage to his shoulder was too severe. He'll be evacuated to England once he's stable." Relief mixed with sadness washed over James. Goldman had been with them since the beginning. His quick mind and steady voice over the radio had been a constant in their lives. "Can I see him?" James asked. "Briefly. He's still under sedation." James entered the makeshift recovery ward, finding Goldman pale but breathing steadily, his shoulder and chest heavily bandaged. He placed a hand gently on the young man's uninjured arm. "You did good, Ben," he said quietly. "Really good. Rest now. The war's over for you." Goldman's eyes flickered open briefly. "Sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The others?" "They're fine. We all made it." A ghost of a smile crossed Goldman's face before he drifted back to sleep. When James returned to where Thunderbolt was being repaired, he found a young replacement waiting. Private Billy Jenkins, a fresh-faced 18-year-old from Ohio who had arrived in Europe just a week earlier. "Private Jenkins reporting for duty, sir," the boy said, saluting crisply. He looked impossibly young, with freckles across his nose and eyes that had yet to see real combat. "At ease, Private," James replied. "You've been assigned as our new radio operator?" "Yes, sir. I've completed training on the SCR 528 radio set and basic tank operations." James studied the young man, remembering how green they had all been once. "Training is one thing, combat is another. You'll need to learn quickly. This crew has been together since the beginning. They know their jobs. Your responsibility is to fit in without disrupting their rhythm. Understood?" "Yes, sir. I won't let you down." James nodded. "We move out at 0600 tomorrow. Get your gear stowed and familiarize yourself with the radio setup. Sergeant O'Connor will show you your station." That night, as repairs on Thunderbolt continued, James wrote a letter to Goldman's parents, explaining how their son had been wounded and praising his service. It was one of the hardest letters he had ever written, though not as hard as the ones he had written to the families of men who hadn't survived. Operation Market Garden ultimately failed to achieve its objectives. The bridge too far at Arnhem remained in German hands, and the Allied advance was halted at the Waal River. The armored column withdrew to regroup and prepare for the next offensive. October brought cold rains and mud that made tank operations increasingly difficult. The war settled into a grinding advance as the Allies pushed toward Germany, yard by yard. Thunderbolt participated in numerous small engagements, with Private Jenkins gradually finding his place within the crew. The young radio man was eager to learn and quick to respond, though he lacked Goldman's intuitive understanding of battlefield communications. In late November, they were ordered to the Harrington Forest, a densely wooded area on the German border, where American infantry had been fighting a brutal battle for weeks. Their mission was to support an attack on a German strongpoint that had been holding up the advance. The forest was a nightmare for tanks. Limited visibility, narrow trails, and ground saturated with mines and booby traps. They had been there only 2 days when disaster struck. An artillery barrage caught them in the open, forcing them to seek cover among the trees. As O'Connor maneuvered Thunderbolt off the trail, a tremendous explosion lifted the tank's right side. They had struck a mine powerful enough to damage the suspension and throw a track. "Status!" James called out as the tank settled back onto the ground at an awkward angle. "Right track completely severed," O'Connor reported. "We're immobile." "Any casualties?" "All crew intact, sir," Mendez confirmed. James assessed the situation quickly. They were stranded in hostile territory with night approaching. Repair under these conditions would be impossible. "Goldman, radio our position and status," he began, then caught himself. "Jenkins, send our coordinates to battalion. Request recovery vehicle support if available." The young radio man worked the set. "No response, sir. The forest is blocking transmission." "Keep trying different frequencies," James ordered. He turned to the others. "We need to prepare for the possibility of spending the night here. Thompson, Mendez, set up a defensive perimeter. O'Connor, see what you can do to at least get us level again." They worked until darkness made it impossible to continue, then settled into a cold vigil. The sounds of distant artillery and small arms fire echoed through the forest. Rain began to fall, a cold November downpour that seemed to penetrate every seam in the tank's armor. "Sir," Jenkins whispered around midnight, "I'm still not getting through on the radio, but I'm picking up German transmissions. They're close." James tensed. "Can you understand what they're saying?" Jenkins hesitated. "Yes, sir. My mother is German. I grew up speaking it at home." This was news to James. "What are they saying?" "They're discussing patrol routes. One will pass within 100 yards of our position in about 20 minutes. James called the crew together and explained the situation. "We have 2 options. We can hope they miss us in the darkness and continue trying to make radio contact with our forces, or we can attempt to capture the patrol and use their radio to call for help." Thompson spoke first. "If they find us, we're sitting ducks. I say we take the fight to them." Mendez and O'Connor nodded in agreement. James looked at Jenkins. "You're sure about the patrol route?" "Yes, sir. They mentioned the lightning-struck oak as a reference point. That's the big tree about 75 yards east of us." "All right, Thompson, Mendez, you are with me. O'Connor, you and Jenkins stay with the tank. If we're not back in an hour, assume we've been captured and destroy any sensitive materials." They moved out into the rainy darkness, armed with Thompson submachine guns and .45 caliber pistols. The forest floor was treacherous, muddy and strewn with fallen branches that could snap underfoot and give away their position. They reached the lightning-struck oak and took cover, waiting. 10 minutes later, Jenkins' intelligence proved accurate as a 5-man German patrol appeared, moving cautiously along the forest path. James gave the signal. They opened fire simultaneously, catching the Germans by surprise. 3 went down immediately. The 4th raised his hands in surrender. The 5th managed to fire a burst from his MP40 before Thompson shot him. As the echoes of gunfire faded, James checked the fallen Germans. 2 were dead, 1 wounded but stable. The prisoner stood trembling, hands still raised. He was young, no older than Jenkins. "Mendez, bind the prisoner and the wounded man," James ordered. "Thompson, check their equipment for anything useful." Thompson discovered a functional radio among the German gear. "This could work, sir." They brought the prisoners and equipment back to Thunderbolt. Jenkins confirmed that the German radio was operational and could reach American frequencies. "Call it in," James instructed. "Give our coordinates and situation." Jenkins made contact with an American artillery unit 5 miles away. They relayed the message to battalion headquarters, which promised to send a recovery team at first light. The remainder of the night passed tensely but without further incident. At dawn, the recovery vehicle arrived, along with a medical team that took charge of the wounded German. The prisoner was sent to the rear for interrogation. By noon, Thunderbolt had been repaired sufficiently to limp back to the battalion's position for more comprehensive work. As the maintenance crews swarmed over the tank, Colonel Matthews approached James. "That was quick thinking with the German patrol, Harrington," he said. "Your new radio man's language skills came in handy." "Yes, sir, though I wish he had mentioned that capability earlier." Matthews frowned. "There's been some concern about that. Military intelligence wants to question him. His family background raises security concerns." James felt a surge of protectiveness toward the young radio man. "Sir, Jenkins risked his life to help capture that patrol. If he had German sympathies, he could have given us away." "I understand, but procedures must be followed. MI will speak with him today." As Matthews walked away, James sought out Jenkins, finding him helping O'Connor with repairs. "Jenkins, a word." The young man followed him to a private spot near the maintenance area. "Military intelligence wants to speak with you about your German language skills and background," James informed him. Jenkins paled. "Sir, I swear I'm loyal to America. My parents came over when I was a baby. My father fought against the Kaiser in the last war." "I believe you, but you should have disclosed your language abilities during your assignment. It's valuable information that could have been put to use." "I was afraid, sir. Some of the other replacements got assigned to rear areas when they mentioned German relatives. I wanted to serve at the front." James placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "I'll speak on your behalf. Your actions last night demonstrated your loyalty, but from now on, complete disclosure. Understood?" "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The military intelligence officers interviewed Jenkins for 3 hours, ultimately clearing him for continued service. His language skills were noted in his file as an asset rather than a liability. December brought bitter cold and the first snows of winter. Thunderbolt and the rest of the battalion were pulled back for rest and refit, having been in near constant action since D-Day. They were billeted in a small Belgian town where the grateful residents opened their homes to the American soldiers. James used the time to catch up on administrative tasks, including writing commendations for his crew. Thompson had been recommended for promotion to sergeant based on his exemplary performance. James also received a letter from Major Stern, the medical officer who had helped with Thompson's son. The news was good. Johnny Thompson had received specialized treatment at Walter Reed and was now thriving. On December 16th, the relative calm was shattered by urgent orders to move out. The Germans had launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, what would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had thrown his reserves into a desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. Thunderbolt and the rest of the battalion were ordered to move immediately to counter the German advance. The weather was atrocious, heavy snow and freezing temperatures that tested both men and machines. O'Connor worked miracles keeping the Sherman's engine running in the bitter cold. They reached the town of Bastogne just ahead of the German forces that would soon surround it. The 101st Airborne Division was dug in around the town, but they desperately needed tank support to counter the German armor. On December 20th, James was summoned to a meeting with Colonel Matthews and a civilian he recognized immediately. Walter Sullivan, and the war correspondent they had met in Normandy. "Sullivan's been embedded with the 101st, Matthews explained, but he has information about a special German unit operating in this sector." Sullivan nodded grimly. "They're calling it the Ghost Division, an SS Panzer unit equipped with King Tiger tanks. They've been responsible for numerous atrocities against Belgian civilians and captured Allied soldiers." James frowned. "I've heard rumors, but nothing official." "It's more than rumors," Sullivan said. "I've seen the evidence myself. But here's what you need to know as a tank commander. Their lead vehicle is commanded by Colonel Klaus Wagner, an American-born German who defected in 1938. He's a tactician who understands our doctrine and equipment. His tank has been specially modified with additional armor on the frontal glacis. Standard rounds won't penetrate." "What's your interest in this, Sullivan?" James asked. "This sounds like more than a newspaper story." Sullivan exchanged a glance with Colonel Matthews, who nodded slightly. "I'm not just a correspondent, Captain Harrington. I work with the OSS. We've been tracking Wagner's unit since they massacred an entire village near Normandy." James absorbed this revelation, suddenly understanding Sullivan's detailed knowledge of military operations. "And you're telling me this because?" "Intelligence suggests Wagner's unit is heading toward Bastogne. If they break through, the 101st won't be able to hold." We need your company to intercept and neutralize them, especially Wagner's command tank. Colonel Matthews spread a map on the table. We've identified their likely approach route here. Through this valley, 5 miles northeast of town. Your company will set up an ambush position on these ridges. You'll have artillery support from the 101st's guns. James studied the map, noting the terrain features. When do we move out? Tonight, under cover of darkness. We need to be in position before dawn. As the meeting concluded, Sullivan pulled James aside. There's something else you should know. Wagner has a personal vendetta against American armor units. He specifically targets tank commanders, using his 88mm gun to pick them off in their cupolas. Be careful up there. James nodded his thanks for the warning, though he had no intention of changing his practice of commanding from the exposed position. A tank commander who couldn't see the battlefield was a danger to his crew and others. That night, Thunderbolt led the company through the snow-covered forest to the designated ambush position. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and the wind cut through clothing like a knife. They positioned the tanks in hull-down positions behind the ridge, with only their turrets exposed to the valley below. Now we wait, James told his crew. Try to get some rest. I'll take first watch. Standing in the cupola, James surveyed the moonlit valley. Snow had transformed the battlefield into something eerily beautiful, the white expanse unmarked by violence. Yet, in the distance he could hear the rumble of heavy engines, the Ghost Division approaching. As dawn broke, Thompson relieved him at the watch. Get some sleep, sir, the gunner urged. You've been up all night. James nodded, too exhausted to argue. He dropped down into the tank's interior, finding a relatively comfortable position in his seat, and closed his eyes. He was awakened less than an hour later by Thompson's urgent voice. Sir, they're coming, just as Sullivan predicted. James climbed back to the cupola, binoculars raised. Through the morning mist, he could see them, the dark shapes of German armor moving in column along the valley floor. At the head was a massive King Tiger, its long 88mm gun sweeping back and forth like the snout of some prehistoric predator. That's Wagner's tank, James said. Pass the word to the company. Hold fire until they reach the marker. The marker was a lightning-blasted pine tree at the narrowest point of the valley. When the Germans reached that point, they would be caught in a crossfire with nowhere to retreat. The minutes stretched agonizingly as the German column approached. 5 King Tigers, followed by several Panzer IVs and self-propelled guns. A formidable force, but one that had walked into a trap. Wagner's tank passed the fallen pine. James raised his hand, then dropped it sharply. All tanks, fire! The ridgelines erupted with the thunder of American guns. Sherman tanks firing from concealed positions on both sides of the valley caught the German column in a devastating crossfire. 2 of the trailing King Tigers were hit immediately, their ammunition cooking off in spectacular explosions. But Wagner's tank reacted with surprising speed, turning its massive turret toward the greater threat, Thunderbolt's position. He's targeting us, James warned. O'Connor, reverse now! The Sherman lurched backward just as the German 88mm gun fired. The shell passed through the space where they had been moments before, exploding against the ridge behind them. Thompson, target his track, James ordered. Immobilize him. Thompson traversed the gun and fired. The shell struck the King Tiger's right track, shattering several links but not completely disabling it. Wagner's tank continued to advance, returning fire with deadly accuracy. A Sherman to their right erupted in flames as a German shell penetrated its turret. We need to hit him from the side, James decided. O'Connor, move us to that draw on the right. Thompson, be ready. They used the terrain to maneuver around the King Tiger's flank, emerging where its armor was thinnest. But Wagner anticipated the move, pivoting his tank to keep its strongest frontal armor facing them. He knows our tactics, James realized. Sullivan was right. The battle raged for 20 minutes, with losses mounting on both sides. 3 of the 5 King Tigers had been destroyed, but they had taken 4 Shermans with them. Wagner's tank remained operational, seemingly invulnerable to their fire. Then James spotted a weakness. The King Tiger had backed against a steep embankment to protect its rear armor, but in doing so had exposed a small gap between the top of its hull and the turret ring. Thompson, see that gap where the turret meets the hull? Yes, sir, but it's a small target. Can you hit it? Thompson took a long moment to consider. I need to get closer, 300 yards or less. O'Connor, get us there, James ordered. Mendez, smoke rounds to cover our approach. The loader slammed a smoke shell into the breach, and Thompson fired it directly in front of the King Tiger. As white smoke billowed around the German tank, Thunderbolt charged forward. Wagner, realizing what was happening, fired blindly through the smoke. Shells exploded around them, but O'Connor kept driving, reducing the range. 300 yards, James called out. Thompson, take the shot when you have it. Ready, Thompson confirmed, his voice steady despite the danger. The smoke began to clear, revealing the massive form of the King Tiger. Its turret was traversing, searching for them. Now, Thompson! The Sherman's gun fired. The armor-piercing round struck precisely at the turret ring. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a jet of flame erupted from the seam as the shell penetrated into the tank's interior. The King Tiger shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its hatches. Unlike their previous encounters, no crew members emerged. The ammunition inside detonated, blowing the heavy turret completely off the hull in a catastrophic explosion that marked the end of Colonel Klaus Wagner and his Ghost Division. With their commander gone, the remaining German vehicles retreated, pursued by American tanks and artillery fire. The threat to Bastogne had been eliminated, at least from this direction. As they surveyed the battlefield afterward, Walter Sullivan appeared, camera in hand. "You did it, Harrington," he said, snapping photographs of the destroyed King Tiger. "Wagner's reign of terror is over." James, exhausted from the battle, merely nodded. The victory had come at a high cost. 8 Shermans destroyed, over 20 men dead or wounded. But Bastogne would hold, and the German offensive had been blunted. Sullivan lowered his camera. "There's something I've been authorized to tell you. That information about Thompson's son, it didn't just happen. Your father pulled strings at Walter Reed to get the boy admitted to an experimental treatment program." James stared at the correspondent in shock. "My father did that?" Sullivan nodded. "General Harrington has been watching your progress since Normandy. He's proud of what you've accomplished, though he'd probably never tell you that himself." The revelation left James speechless. His father, the traditional infantryman who had disparaged his choice to join the Armored Corps, had been working behind the scenes to support him and his men. That night, as snow fell gently on the scarred battlefield, James wrote a letter to his father. He described the battle in professional terms, but added a personal note at the end. "Thank you for what you did for Thompson's boy. It means more than you know, both to him and to me." The Battle of the Bulge raged on through Christmas and into January, with American forces gradually pushing the Germans back to their starting positions. Thunderbolt and its crew participated in several more engagements, though none as dramatic as their encounter with Wagner's King Tiger. By mid-January 1945, the German offensive had been completely defeated. Allied forces resumed their advance toward the Rhine and into Germany itself. The end of the war in Europe, though still months away, now seemed inevitable rather than merely possible. For James Harrington and the crew of Thunderbolt, the hardest fighting still lay ahead, but they had survived the worst that winter and the enemy could throw at them. They had become more than a crew. They were a family forged in the crucible of combat. As they prepared to cross into Germany, James knew that whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together, just as they had since that first day at Fort Hood, when 5 strangers had become the crew of Thunderbolt. January 1945 brought bone-chilling cold to the German border as American forces prepared to push into the Nazi homeland. The snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, scene of the desperate winter battle now known as the Bulge, gave way to the rolling hills of western Germany. Captain James Harrington stood in Thunderbolt's cupola, binoculars trained on the small industrial city of Ridgewood that lay in the valley before them. "Looks quiet," he observed to Walter Sullivan, who had become a near-permanent fixture with their unit since the destruction of Wagner's King Tiger. The war correspondent, now openly acknowledged as an OSS operative, nodded grimly. "Too quiet. Intelligence reports significant German armor in the area, but they're not showing themselves. Hiding in the city," James surmised, "using the buildings for cover." "Exactly, and there are still civilians in there. The Germans have prevented evacuation." James lowered his binoculars, digesting this information. Urban combat was among the most dangerous for tanks. The confined spaces allowed enemy infantry to approach with magnetic mines and other anti-tank weapons. Buildings provided perfect concealment for heavy guns that could target a tank's more vulnerable side and rear armor. "What's our objective?" James asked. Sullivan pulled out a map. "The main bridge over the Ruhr River runs through the center of town. Army engineers needed intact to support the advance toward Berlin. Your company is to secure and hold the bridge until reinforcements arrive." "And the German armor?" "At least 3 Tigers confirmed, possibly more Panzer IVs. They're commanded by Major Wilhelm Schultz, one of their more experienced officers. He's been ordered to destroy the bridge rather than let it fall into our hands. James studied the map carefully. The main avenue through Ridgewood led straight to the bridge, but it would be a perfect killing ground for defenders. Alternative routes through narrower streets would be difficult for tanks to navigate. We'll need infantry support, James said. The 28th Infantry Division will accompany you, Sullivan confirmed. They're veterans, fought in the Harrington Forest. James nodded, formulating a plan. We'll approach from multiple directions. Split the company into 3 elements to divide the German response. He returned to his tank where the crew waited expectantly. Thompson was cleaning his personal sidearm, a ritual he performed before every significant engagement. Mendez checked the ammunition stores, ensuring shells were properly stacked for quick loading. O'Connor made final adjustments to the engine, coaxing every possible ounce of performance from the reliable machine. Young Jenkins monitored the radio, noting updates from other units. We move at dawn, James informed them. The objective is the bridge in Ridgewood. Germans have armor in the city, including Tigers. Tigers in an urban environment, and O'Connor mused. Their size will work against them in those narrow streets. That's what we're counting on, James agreed. But they still have that 80mm gun, and in close quarters, they won't miss. They spent the remainder of the day preparing. Extra ammunition was loaded. The track tension was adjusted for maximum traction on the cobblestone streets they would encounter. Maps of Ridgewood were studied, potential ambush points identified and planned for. As night fell, James gathered the entire company for a final briefing. This will be different from what we've faced before, he told them. In the open field, we can maneuver. In the city, we'll be constrained. Buildings will block our view and limit our options. Stay alert, stay in communication, and watch for infantry with anti-tank weapons on the upper floors. The men listened intently, faces solemn in the light of the Coleman lanterns. They had been in combat since D-Day, had seen comrades die, had endured the worst that war could offer. Yet tomorrow would bring new challenges. One more thing, James added. There are civilians in the city. Watch your fire. We're fighting to liberate these people, not kill them. Dawn broke cold and clear over the German countryside. Thunderbolt led the first element of tanks down the main road toward Ridgewood, with infantry walking alongside for protection. The city's outskirts appeared deserted, windows shuttered, streets empty. Eyes sharp, James cautioned. This is too easy. They had advanced 3 blocks into the city when the first shot came. A Panzerfaust rocket fired from a second-story window that narrowly missed Thunderbolt's turret. The infantry responded immediately, pouring fire into the building as the tanks continued forward. First and third platoons, report, James called over the radio. First platoon, encountering heavy resistance on the north approach, came the reply. 2 Panzer IVs spotted. Third platoon moving up the south road. No contact yet. They reached a small square where the road divided around a central monument. As Thunderbolt emerged into the open space, James spotted movement down a side street. Thompson, traverse right, he ordered sharply. Tiger at 2 o'clock. The German heavy tank was partially concealed behind a bombed-out storefront, its massive 88mm gun trained directly at them. Thompson rotated the turret with practiced speed, but the Tiger fired first. The shell screamed past Thunderbolt, missing by inches, and demolished a building behind them. The concussion rocked the Sherman violently. Return fire, James commanded. Thompson fired, the 76mm shell striking the Tiger's frontal armor. Sparks flew, but the German tank appeared undamaged. No penetration, Thompson reported tersely. O'Connor, get us behind that fountain for cover, James directed. Mendez, load armor piercing. The Sherman lurched forward as O'Connor guided it behind the stone fountain in the center of the square. The Tiger fired again, the shell smashing through the fountain and showering Thunderbolt with stone fragments. Jenkins, alert first platoon, James called. We need support at the central square. Sir, first platoon is engaged with their own targets, Jenkins replied. They can't disengage. James quickly reassessed. We need to flank that Tiger. O'Connor, can you get us down that alley to the right? It's tight, sir, but we can make it. Do it. Thunderbolt reversed, then turned sharply into the narrow alleyway. Brick walls scraped against the tank's sides as O'Connor skillfully maneuvered through the confined space. They emerged on a perpendicular street that would bring them to the Tiger's flank. Slowly now, James cautioned. We need surprise. They crept forward, engine throttled down to minimize noise. At the corner, James peered cautiously around the building edge. The Tiger remained in position, its commander scanning for targets from his cupola. Thompson, target the rear armor, just below the turret, James instructed. Wait for my command. They edged forward until Thompson had a clear shot. The German commander suddenly spotted them, shouting to his crew as he dropped into the turret. Fire, James ordered. The Sherman's gun roared. The shell struck precisely where James had indicated, penetrating the Tiger's thinner rear armor. A moment later, flames erupted from the German tank's hatches as the ammunition inside ignited. Target destroyed, Thompson confirmed. First blood to us, James acknowledged. But there are at least 2 more out there. Let's keep moving toward the bridge. They continued through the city streets, encountering sporadic resistance from German infantry, but no more tanks. The sounds of combat echoed from other sectors where the remaining elements of the company were engaged. 3rd Platoon reports they have reached the bridge approach, Jenkins relayed from the radio. No sign of demolition charges yet. Tell them to hold position, James responded. We're 3 blocks away. As they turned onto the avenue leading directly to the bridge, a civilian suddenly darted from a doorway, waving frantically at them. It was a woman in her 30s, her clothes worn but clean. Jenkins, you speak German, James called down. See what she wants. The young radio man translated as the woman spoke rapidly, pointing toward a side street. Sir, she says there's a German tank hiding around the corner, waiting to ambush any vehicles approaching the bridge. And there's something else. They have civilians gathered in the square as human shields. James's jaw tightened. Ask her how many tanks. After a brief exchange, Jenkins reported, just 1 Tiger, sir, commanded by an officer she calls the Butcher. Must be this Major Schultz that Sullivan mentioned. She says he's threatened to kill hostages if the bridge is not left to German control. James considered the situation. A frontal assault would endanger the civilians. Attempting to bypass the threat might allow the Germans time to destroy the bridge. Tell her to find shelter immediately, he decided. O'Connor, take us down this parallel street. We'll approach from an unexpected direction. The woman nodded gratefully and disappeared back into the building. Thunderbolt moved carefully down the indicated route, a narrow street that ran alongside the river. Sir, Jenkins called up, 1st Platoon reports they've destroyed the 2nd Tiger, but 2 of our tanks were lost. James acknowledged the report grimly. The victory was coming at a high cost. They approached the square near the bridge from the riverside, using buildings for cover. James could see the 3rd Tiger positioned directly in front of the bridge approach, its gun trained on the main avenue. Behind it, German soldiers had gathered about 30 civilians, mostly women and children, keeping them in a tight group that would be in the line of fire of any attacking force. We can't risk a direct shot, James said. Too many civilians in the potential impact zone. What's the play, sir? O'Connor asked. James studied the scene. We need to draw the Tiger away from those people. He made a quick decision. Jenkins, raise Sullivan on the radio. I need his help. Minutes later, Walter Sullivan appeared beside a building across the square, having worked his way through back alleys to reach the position James had specified. This is crazy, Harrington, the OSS agent muttered as James outlined his plan. But it might work. Sullivan removed his helmet and jacket, making himself look more like a civilian correspondent than a military man. Then, camera in hand, he walked boldly into the square, apparently taking photographs of the damaged buildings. The German soldiers spotted him immediately, shouting warnings. Sullivan appeared to notice them for the first time, raising his hands while continuing to hold his camera. As James had anticipated, he was brought before Major Schultz, who emerged from the Tiger's turret to interrogate the apparent American journalist who had wandered into his position. Now O'Connor, James ordered. Full speed. Thunderbolt burst from cover, racing across the square toward the Tiger. Schultz saw them coming and dropped back into his tank, but his gunner was not at his position, having exited to help guard the civilians. Sullivan used the distraction to pull a concealed pistol, shooting the nearest German soldier and shouting for the civilians to run. Chaos erupted in the square as people scattered in all directions. The Tiger's turret began to rotate, but Thunderbolt reached it before it could bring its gun to bear. O'Connor rammed the Sherman directly into the German tank's side, the impact jamming the Tiger's turret and preventing it from traversing. Thompson, point-blank range, James called. Put it right against their hull and fire. The Sherman's gun, pressed almost directly against the Tiger's side armor, fired with a thunderous roar. At such close range, even the German tank's thick armor couldn't withstand the impact. The shell penetrated, igniting ammunition inside. Back up, now, James ordered. O'Connor threw Thunderbolt into reverse just as the Tiger erupted in flames. The German crew attempted to escape, but only one made it out before the tank exploded. the force of the blast washing over the Sherman like a physical blow. In the aftermath, James found Sullivan helping the civilians move away from the bridge. "That was too close," the OSS agent said, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. "But effective," James noted. "The bridge is ours and the civilians are safe." Sullivan nodded, then pointed to a small figure huddled against a building wall. It was a girl, perhaps 8 years old, clearly injured and terrified. "Not all of them," Sullivan said grimly. James approached the child carefully. She shrank back, eyes wide with fear. "Jenkins," he called, "I need you here." The young radio man hurried over, speaking gently to the girl in German. She responded hesitantly, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face. "Her name is Hannah," Jenkins translated. "She was separated from her parents during the fighting. She's Jewish. They were in hiding until the Germans found them this morning. She doesn't know where her parents were taken." James knelt beside the girl, noticing the blood seeping through her tattered dress. "She's wounded. We need to get her medical attention immediately." "Sir, our medics are with the infantry on the other side of the square," Jenkins reported. James had made a quick decision. "We'll use Thunderbolt as a shield. O'Connor, bring the tank over here. We'll put her inside and use the tank to protect the medics while they work." They carefully lifted the injured child into the tank, where Mendez fashioned a makeshift bandage for her wounded leg. O'Connor positioned Thunderbolt to provide cover, and James called for the medics. As they worked to stabilize the girl, James kept watch from the turret. The sounds of battle were fading across the city as German resistance collapsed. First platoon reported securing the north end of the bridge. Third platoon confirmed that no demolition charges had been placed. The bridge over the Ruhr had been captured intact, a significant strategic victory that would allow Allied forces to continue their advance into Germany without delay. But as James watched the medics treating the small, wounded girl, such strategic considerations seemed suddenly abstract. This child, frightened, injured, separated from her family, represented the true cost of war. Not just in soldiers' lives, but in suffering inflicted on the innocent. "Will she be all right?" he asked the senior medic. "The wound isn't life-threatening," the man replied, "but she needs proper hospital care. We'll evacuate her with the other wounded." "Her parents?" The medic shook his head. "If they were taken by the SS, there's little hope. But we'll report her status to refugee services. Sometimes miracles happen." James nodded, hoping the man was right. He descended into the tank where Jenkins was still comforting the girl, speaking to her softly in German. "She asked if we're angels," the young radio man said with a sad smile. "I told her we're just soldiers, but that we'll take care of her." "You did good, Jenkins," James said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "All of you did." He looked around at his crew: O'Connor, Thompson, Mendez, Jenkins. Men who had become more than comrades through months of shared danger. "Thunderbolt has never let us down, and neither have any of you." That night, as they established defensive positions around the bridge, James wrote in his journal. He described the day's battle objectively, noting losses and tactical decisions as he always did. But he added a personal reflection he had never before committed to paper. "Today I understood why we fight, not for territory or strategic advantage, but for children like Hannah, for the chance to restore a world where they can live without fear." Perhaps that's what my father meant when he spoke of a soldier's duty, not glory or victory, but protection of those who cannot protect themselves. The capture of Ridgewood's Bridge accelerated the Allied advance into Germany's industrial heartland. Thunderbolt and its crew participated in numerous actions over the following weeks as the noose tightened around the Third Reich. In late April, they were among the units that liberated a concentration camp near the town of Buchenwald. The horrors they witnessed there left even the most battle-hardened soldiers speechless. Rows of barracks filled with living skeletons, mass graves containing thousands of bodies. Evidence of atrocities beyond imagination. Mendez, who had seen his share of carnage in battle, wept openly at the sight. Thompson stood rigid, his face a mask of controlled fury. O'Connor worked silently, using Thunderbolt's winch to help clear barricades so that medical teams could enter the camp. Jenkins translated for survivors, his young face growing older with each terrible story he heard. James moved among his men, offering what comfort he could while managing the practical task of securing the area and coordinating with relief organizations. But the experience marked them all in ways that combat never had. That evening, Walter Sullivan found James sitting alone beside Thunderbolt, staring at nothing. "How do you make sense of this?" James asked without preamble. Sullivan sighed heavily. "You don't. You just remember it and make sure the world remembers too." He held up his camera. "That's why I take these pictures, so no one can ever deny what happened here." James nodded slowly. My father fought in the last war to make the world safe for democracy. We're fighting in this one for the same reason. But after seeing this, he gestured toward the camp. I wonder if humanity deserves saving. The people who did this deserve your doubt, Sullivan replied. The people they did it to deserve your faith and your protection. The words resonated with what James had written after Ridgewood. Protection of the innocent. Perhaps that was the only purpose that mattered in the end. The final weeks of the war passed in a blur of constant movement. The German army was collapsing, though pockets of fanatical resistance remained. Thunderbolt led its company through the heart of Germany, reaching the Elbe River by late April. There they received orders to halt. The Allied High Command had decided that Berlin would be left to the advancing Soviet forces. For James and his crew, the fighting phase of the war in Europe was effectively over. On May 8, 1945, the official announcement came. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The celebration among the troops was subdued. There was relief, certainly, but also exhaustion and awareness of the cost. Too many friends had died. Too many horrors had been witnessed. And for many units, including James's, the war wasn't truly over. They expected to be redeployed to the Pacific for the final push against Japan. But for now, there was a moment to breathe, to reflect on all they had endured since that distant June day when they had landed on Normandy's beaches. In the weeks that followed, occupation duty replaced combat operations. Thunderbolt and its crew were assigned to a small German town, enforcing curfews and helping to distribute relief supplies to the civilian population. James received a letter from his father, congratulating him on his battlefield promotion to major and his recommendation for the Silver Star for his actions at Ridgewood. The general's tone was warmer than in any previous communication, expressing pride without reservation. He also received word about Thompson's son, Johnny, who was thriving after his treatment at Walter Reed. The gunner, upon hearing the news, performed his duties with a lighter heart. The shadow of worry finally lifted from his shoulders. In late July, James was called to division headquarters. He expected to receive orders for redeployment to the Pacific. Instead, he was informed that the war against Japan was likely to end soon, thanks to a new weapon of unprecedented power that had been deployed against the Japanese homeland. You and your men have done enough, Major, the division commander told him. You'll be rotating home with the first group. Your war is over. The news left James with conflicted feelings. Relief at the prospect of returning home, sadness at the thought of leaving Thunderbolt, the tank that had carried them through hell and back. Concern for his men and what they would face in returning to civilian life. He gathered his crew to share the news. We're going home, he told them simply. All of us, together. The division commander has ensured we'll stay as a unit until we reach New York. O'Connor grinned broadly. Back to Detroit. My old man's held my job at the auto plant. Thompson nodded, his eyes distant. Kentucky, my boy, my wife. It's been so long. Mendez crossed himself. New Mexico, the desert. I never thought I'd miss it. Jenkins, youngest of them all, looked uncertain. I enlisted right out of high school. Don't really know what I'll do now. College, James told him. The GI Bill will pay for it. A mind like yours shouldn't go to waste. The young man brightened at the suggestion. They spent their final days in Germany, preparing Thunderbolt for transfer to a replacement crew. O'Connor was especially meticulous, ensuring every mechanical system was in perfect order. Thompson cleaned the gun until it gleamed. Mendez organized the ammunition storage to his exacting standards. Jenkins wrote a detailed manual for the radio systems. For James, there was a paperwork, endless forms documenting their equipment, personnel records, and after-action reports. But he made time for one personal mission, locating Hannah, the Jewish girl they had rescued in Ridgewood. With Sullivan's help, he traced her to a Red Cross refugee center in Frankfurt. She had recovered from her physical wounds, but the emotional trauma remained. Her parents had indeed been taken by the SS, and no trace of them had been found. What will happen to her? James asked the center's director. She has no known relatives, the woman replied. Eventually, she'll be sent to an orphanage or placed with a foster family. But with so many displaced children, the system is overwhelmed. James nodded thoughtfully. I'd like to help ensure she's taken care of. Can I make arrangements for that? The director explained the process for sponsoring a refugee child. James completed the necessary paperwork, providing funds from his accumulated pay that would support Hannah's care and education for years to come. When he visited her to say goodbye, she recognized him immediately. The tank man, she said in halting English, having begun to learn the language at the center. That's right, he smiled. "I wanted to make sure you were doing all right." She nodded solemnly. "I am sad for my parents, but the ladies here are kind." James knelt to her level. "I've made arrangements to help take care of you. And when you're older, if you ever want to come to America, I'll help with that too." Her eyes widened. "America? Where the streets have gold," he chuckled. "Not exactly, but it's a good place. A place where you can build a new life." Their transport ship departed from Bremerhaven in August 1945, just days after Japan's surrender ended World War II completely. The voyage home was uneventful, a welcome contrast to the tension-filled journey they had made to England more than a year and a half earlier. As the ship entered New York Harbor, James joined his crew at the rail. The Statue of Liberty came into view, her torch raised in welcome. Many of the returning soldiers cheered, some wept openly, all felt the profound significance of the moment. "We made it," O'Connor said quietly. "All of us." "When you consider the odds," James nodded, understanding what was left unspoken. Of the original tank crews that had landed on D-Day, fewer than 30% had survived to see this moment. That Thunderbolt's entire crew had come through was nothing short of miraculous. They were processed through Fort Dix in New Jersey, receiving their discharge papers and final pay. Before they separated to return to their respective homes, James gathered them one last time. "What we experienced together, what we accomplished, will always bind us," he told them. "In the years to come, when you look back on this time, remember that you were part of something greater than yourselves. And know that I could not have asked for a finer crew or better men." They exchanged addresses and promises to stay in touch. Then, with handshakes and backslaps that inadequately expressed their feelings, they went their separate ways. James returned to Massachusetts, where Sarah had waited faithfully. They were married that autumn, a quiet ceremony attended by family and a few close friends. His father, now Lieutenant General William Harrington, attended in full-dress uniform, proud of his son in a way he had never been able to express during the war. Life gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. James accepted a position teaching military history at West Point, passing on the lessons he had learned in combat to a new generation of officers. He and Sarah had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, and built a comfortable life in the growing prosperity of post-war America. He stayed in touch with his crew over the years. O'Connor eventually opened his own auto repair shop in Detroit. Thompson returned to his farm in Kentucky, where his son Johnny grew into a strong young man who would later serve in Korea. Mendez used his GI Bill benefits to study engineering, designing irrigation systems that transformed parts of the New Mexico desert into productive farmland. Jenkins, true to James's suggestion, attended college and eventually became a professor of German literature. Walter Sullivan's photographs and articles about the war won a Pulitzer Prize. His book, Steel Courage, chronicling the exploits of Thunderbolt and its crew, became a bestseller in 1956. In 30 years after the end of the war, James organized a reunion in Boston. O'Connor, Thompson, and Jenkins attended. Mendez had passed away the previous year after a brief illness. They shared memories, showed photographs of children and grandchildren, and marveled at how the world had changed. The Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, civil rights, space exploration, history had continued its relentless march. James had one surprise for them. He had located and preserved Thunderbolt, arranging for its restoration and donation to a military museum in Lexington. The day after their reunion dinner, he took them to see their old tank, now gleaming as it had when it first rolled off the assembly line in 1944. "She looks good," O'Connor approved, running his hand along the hull. "They did a fine job." Thompson peered into the gunner's position, a wistful smile on his face. "Seems smaller than I remember." Jenkins shook his head in wonder. "Hard to believe we spent so much time in such a confined space." James watched them reminisce, feeling a profound sense of closure. The war had marked them all, had shaped their lives in ways both obvious and subtle, but they had survived, had built lives and families in the peace they had helped secure. As they prepared to leave, an unexpected visitor arrived, a middle-aged woman accompanied by a teenage girl. James recognized her immediately, though 30 years had passed. "Hannah," he said, stepping forward. She smiled, the frightened child of Ridgewood, now a poised woman in her 30s. "Major Harrington, or should I say Professor now?" "James, please." He turned to his former crew. "Gentlemen, this is Hannah Bergman. We helped her in Ridgewood, if you remember." Recognition dawned on their faces. Hannah introduced her daughter, Rachel, explaining that they had immigrated to America in the 1960s. She had become a pediatrician, dedicating her life to helping children as she had been helped. I never properly thanked you, she told them. All these years, I've carried the memory of the men who saved me when I had lost everything. You gave me more than just medical care. You gave me hope. There was no adequate response to such words. They simply nodded, accepting her gratitude with the quiet dignity of men who had done what was necessary without expectation of thanks. As they stood together beside Thunderbolt one final time, James reflected on the long journey that had brought them to this moment. From the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, from young men in the prime of life to the threshold of old age. So much had changed. Yet the bond forged in those desperate days remained unbroken. The tank that had carried them through history stood silent now, a memorial to sacrifices made and courage demonstrated. But the true legacy of Thunderbolt lived on in the men who had crewed her, in the lives they had built, in the world they had helped to save. Lexington, Massachusetts, Veterans Day present. The memories wash over Colonel James Iron Jack Harrington as he sits in the commander's position of the restored Sherman tank. Around him, a crowd is gathered for the book signing at the USS Constitution Museum. Walter Sullivan's son, Michael, now a historian in his own right, has republished his father's book with new material and photographs. At 95, James finds the past sometimes more vivid than the present. The faces of his crew appear before him with perfect clarity. O'Connor with his mechanical genius, Thompson with his steady aim, Mendez with his quiet strength, Jenkins with his youthful enthusiasm. All gone now, passed on to whatever awaits beyond this life. Yet here, in the confines of Thunderbolt's turret, they seem almost present. As if at any moment Thompson might call a target, Mendez announce a shell loaded, O'Connor guide them forward into battle once more. A young army captain helps him descend from the tank. "Careful, sir," he says respectfully. "It's a long way down." Inside the museum, James finds himself the center of attention. Veterans of later conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, approach to shake his hand, to express their admiration. Younger people ask for autographs, for stories, for wisdom. He obliges as best he can, though speaking of the war has never been easy. Some experiences defy language, exist beyond the capacity of words to capture. But he tries, feeling a duty to remember, to bear witness. Near the end of the event, a distinguished elderly woman approaches his table. Though her hair is silver now, her eyes are familiar. "Hannah," he says, rising to greet her. "I couldn't miss this," she says, embracing him gently. "Not when I heard you would be here." They speak briefly of their lives since their last meeting decades ago. Her daughter Rachel is now a surgeon. She has grandchildren, great-grandchildren even. A family that would never have existed without the actions of Thunderbolt's crew that day in Ridgewood. "I have something to show you," she says, guiding him to where a small group waits nearby. A middle-aged man, a younger woman, children of various ages. "This is my family. My son David is a professor at Harvard. My daughter Rachel, as I mentioned, is a surgeon. Their children, my grandchildren." James looks at these people, living, breathing testimonies to the value of what he and his men accomplished. One small life saved among millions lost. Yet from that single act, all these others now exist. "It was worth it," he says quietly, more to himself than to her. "All of it." She understands his meaning. "Yes," she agrees, "it was." As the event concludes, James finds himself drawn back to Thunderbolt. The museum is nearly empty now, the crowd dispersed. Only the tank remains, solid and eternal, a monument of steel to courage and sacrifice. He places his hand on the hull, feeling the connection to another time, another self. The young captain who led his men across Europe, who faced death daily, who discovered the true meaning of duty and honor in the crucible of war. "Goodbye, old friend," he whispers to the machine that carried him through history. As he turns to leave, he imagines perhaps a trick of the fading light, perhaps the wishful thinking of an old man's mind, that the tank responds. A slight shudder of the treads, a whisper of metal on metal, like a faithful steed acknowledging its rider one final time. Outside, the sun is setting over Boston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. James pauses to watch, reminded of other sunsets witnessed from Thunderbolt's turret, over the beaches of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, the rivers of Germany. The world has changed beyond recognition since those days. Nations have risen and fallen. Technologies unimaginable then dominate life now. The great conflict that defined his generation has receded into history, known to most only through books and films and museums. Yet some things remain constant. Courage, duty, sacrifice, the bonds formed between those who face danger together, the obligation to protect the innocent, the hope that through all the darkness of human experience, light will eventually prevail. These are the lessons of Thunderbolt, the legacy that James Iron Jack Harrington carries with him as he walks slowly toward the waiting car, his duty discharged, his mission complete. Behind him, as twilight deepens, the Sherman tank stands in silent sentinel, its gun raised in eternal vigilance, its armor bearing the invisible scars of battles long ago, its spirit embodying the indomitable will of the men who once called it home.